like not like
No.
I'm gonna swing the manicure. Yeah. No, I didn't even like the manicure. I hate the big cushion. It's my first manicure ever, and I didn't like it. Sorry. I like it looked nice, but. Oh, scheduled the other. I was like, no way. That's actually one. I never had a I get it all. Someone tried to have me go get a massage. You? I don't like massages. I don't like massages. You don't like massages? I don't like massages. Oh my god. I don't mind doing them, but Josh doesn't like massages. No, I really don't like massages.
Pardon?
Watch out. Megan. Am I about to take your coffee? I did take it. Let it straight. That went over.
Let's see what I can drum up. You got one more mic. Just like
Sure.
That's good. Thank you. Are we on? That's good. Just hung out here, drank in the bars. How about you?
Walking around.
Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to have everyone here. We're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Harvard Political Review, which was founded here at Harvard in 1969 by Vice President Al Gore and two of his roommates, Leverett D41. And it's come a long way since then. The Harvard Political Review has been a student journal for about 30 years, for 30 years now, that it's sort of had a few metamorphoses. It's been, at one point, a very one-sided liberal magazine. Our first cover says, "Vote Socialist," to a conservative magazine in the 70s, largely in the early 70s, then more liberal again in the late 70s through the 80s. We sort of decided that we wanted to be a nonpartisan journal, and that's how we've stayed for the last maybe 15 years or so. And today, it's our pleasure to have this distinguished group of journalists here to discuss political journalism at the turn of the millennium with us. So I'd just like to introduce the panelists and then get out of Walter Isaacson's seat. Mr. Isaacson is the managing editor of Time magazine. Ramesh Ponnuru is of the National Journal. Richard Parker of the Shorenstein Center will be moderating our panel today. Richard Burke over at the end is of the New York Times, and Richard Blow is of George Magazine. So please give them a warm welcome.
Too many Richards.
Yeah, 4 R's and a Walter.
I think what we'll do this morning is leave political statements and large, long-winded openings to elected public officials or those seeking office, and go right into a series of questions that I think are worthwhile talking about here as we begin a new millennium and journalism faces a number of challenges. What I think might be a good starting point is to kick off a conversation about technology and then move on to a couple of other subjects. As all of you know, there has been an enormous discussion about the impact of new technologies, probably significantly best measured by the rise of the internet in the last 4 or 5 years, and a discussion about whether broad-based publications and journalism that reaches out to mass audiences is going to survive much further into the next century, or we're headed into a world of narrowcasting and niche marketing. Who would like to take up the topic here?
I have some credentials to talk about the internet and cyberspace because I did that for about 5 years before I became editor of Time, and I think I was responsible for 2 of the greatest disasters in new media history, losing hundreds of millions of dollars on an interactive network in Florida and then in an internet service called Pathfinder. So having screwed it up so badly, in the days before, if you lost $100 million, you got a high stock market valuation. I was sent back to old media and have reflected a little bit on how it changes what we do. You know, editors of Time or CBS Evening News or any major outlet in the old days used to be gatekeepers. They used to have a real solid control over telling you that's the way it is. You had about 10 or 12 sources you could go to find out what was happening on a political campaign or anything else. And the main thing the internet has done and technology has done is totally blow that apart. From Matt Drudge to 50 different democracy.com type websites to direct websites where you can get the speeches of each of the candidates or listen to people who cater to your own political ideology. Nobody can play gatekeeper anymore. And a lot of people in my end of this trade lament that, but I think it's the greatest possible thing to happen. When people have more choices, when they can turn you off if you turn them off, it both disciplines the process of those of us in journalism and makes us have to have a more serious connection with our readers. Otherwise, they have 1,000, 10,000 other places they can go. It also, I think, ameliorates the problem people sometimes see of media bias, because I think anybody can, you know, if your bias is you like candidates who like animals too much or something, you will find about 20 different sources of information of people who have that same bias. So I think it's liberated the entire coverage of journalism and kept it out of that tight knot of a few gatekeepers.
Yeah, right.
One thing, I think it's a little frightening, though, too. I think Walter's right that there's a lot of opportunities, and it's a good thing. But a scary, frightening thing happened to me just a few days ago. I had written a story from New Hampshire about how the Bush campaign was taken aback by John McCain's rise in the polls in New Hampshire. And I was in the middle of writing this story on Monday, I think. And I sent my editors like a summary of the top of my story in the middle of the day. Then all of a sudden I get calls from the McCain campaign. They said, we saw the Drudge report, and they said, you're going to have a high impact page 1 story, and they knew what my lead was going to be in the next day's paper. And this was like 3 in the afternoon. And so I started getting calls from the Bush people trying to spin me and trying to get me to change my story, which I hadn't finished writing yet. Then I get calls from the McCain campaign saying, yeah, right on, you know, this is a great story. Then I'm getting, you know, I'm telling my editors, I'm still writing this thing. And so I didn't, so it's sort of a frightening thing when that happens. And what do? You can't, like, say I'm not doing this story. And they had somehow gotten a hold of an early sort of billing of my story on the Times news service. And so so because of this capacity and this technology, it ended up sort of shaping what I ended up writing a little bit in the next day's paper in a way that I didn't invite and didn't really want, because when these people called me back and tried to spin me, it did affect a little bit of what I wrote, and it wasn't on page. And the other thing that happened is it advertised to my competitors like the Washington Post that I was doing this story. So the Washington Post then threw together their own story to compete with my story, and they had all afternoon to do it, and it was just very frustrating and disconcerting.
But I think, Rick, that's a scary story, and I can't imagine what a nuisance it must be, but Matt Drudge is really such an extreme case. I mean, he's the guy who makes it possible to criticize. He's really the straw man of the internet journalist, and I think the real test case for whether or not this survives is whether or not it can make money. And I've thought about this a little bit because George began at almost the same time that Slate magazine began. And I think that Slate has almost lost more money than we have, which they're not supposed to do since they're online, and they are not supposed to have the cost of a print magazine. And I still think they haven't really figured out a way how to do this. They began by, or at some point they started charging for subscriptions, and there was such little interest in that then they gave it up. And their primary advertiser now seems to be their owning company. I was interested the other day, I went to look at Dick Morris's new website, which is called vote.com, and which is very Dick Morris-like. It's very odd. But essentially what it is a site where users, whom he calls voters, have to log on and register and give some information, and then they get to vote on an issue, which he then tabulates the results, should ATM fees be made illegal, for example, and sends it to Congress and the White House and that sort of thing. And what was particularly interesting about this site was that I read the privacy statement on there, because after all, this is fairly sophisticated consumer data that he's collecting. And it says, we're collecting this data and we're going to keep it, but we're not going to sell it to anyone. On the other hand, it says, keep checking our privacy statement from time to time because it may change. In other words, if you vote on this thing for a year about 20 different issues, perhaps in a year he'll change his mind. He's been known to do that. And say, okay, I'm going to use this stuff.
His privacy policy is not one you should necessarily
No,
follow.
that's right.
The White House has blocked things from his site because he tabulates the votes and then sends them to the White House, and the White House was so annoyed by that if you try to send something from his site to the White House server, it's blocked.
But like a lot of Dick Morris ideas, there's an element of weird, mad genius to this one, and in fact, it may be the kind of thing, unlike Slate, that I think political journalism on the net is heading towards. It's not even really journalism, it's a more interactive experience.
I was going to say, you described this as valuable data, but of course it's not systematically following any of the standard polling rules. I mean, if someone simply responds to a poll, you've got one of these TV polls from Entertainment Tonight, who's the sexiest man alive. I mean,
right. Well, I meant valuable data in terms of marketing information. Right. I mean, he's getting zip codes, he's getting email addresses, and I think this would be useful for politicians, and it would be useful for, of course, any number of companies.
So is this perhaps one of the problems of this new technology, that it may be more about marketing than about distribution of political information or political education? I mean, this wasn't characteristic of newspapers or news magazines.
I'll tell you one small problem, and I'm about to get Romesh in, but to follow up on what Richard said, I think a problem with the new medium is that it hasn't yet figured out a way to charge people for content. One of the many mistakes we made when we were doing new media at the very beginning, 10 years ago when the web was just developing, was thinking there'd be 3 or 4 revenue streams: advertising, subscription, from users, and maybe e-commerce, marketing to people. Well, when you depend only on advertising and e-commerce, first of all, it's hard to get a business plan that works, as Richard said about Slate. But also, it's insidious. You're not creating something of content that people are willing to pay for. You're instead trying to create things that you can get a lot of marketing information to see if they changed their tires recently, so you can sell Goodyear on having buying your data from you or something. So until the internet finds ways to get people to value what it produces enough that they'll be willing to pay for it, it is just going to become more and more geared to marketing as opposed to creating good content. I'm sorry, Doug.
Ramesh, what are you saying?
Well, I was just thinking that the way that the internet's really affected my own work the most is as a research tool. I mean we shouldn't discount the simple advantages to be gained from just being able to look everything up. Everything is out there, and the other thing is, as I guess what Rick was saying, that you have a more immediate relationship with your readers. I get much more feedback and much faster feedback on the stuff I put out over the net than the stuff I put out on the printed pages.
Does any of you have a sense of whether the audience for net sites is different from your print or broadcast publications? And if it's different, how is it different? I mean, are we getting a lot of essentially propeller heads out there who are fascinated by politics, giving you the feedback and not giving you a representative sample even of your own total subscription base?
I think our readers contain a fair amount of propeller heads from the normal course.
Well, what about time? A little bigger base?
Well, yeah, it's obviously somewhat of a different slice of the market. It's one we go after very, very strongly. It's a smart, young, very aware market. So we spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and you have all of our correspondence on time.com as much as possible. But you don't make money off of doing that.
So here we have a marketing system that is pursuing readers or viewers that don't make money for the producer. Where are we going with this?
Well, I don't know. I'm an editor, not a businessman, so it's hard for me to speak in terms of marketing, but I was thinking editorially, I can see a couple things that will happen. One is that I think people like Rick will start competing less with other daily newspapers and more with people who can break a story in an afternoon or something. And the second thing being that you will find, if Matt Drudge is sort of a trailblazer who's really burning a lot of things down before him, you will find other people who come along who are not so irresponsible and who provide but who are also not necessarily as credentialed or experienced, who may mix reporting with a good deal of more opinion, who may not sort of feel the pressure to report the substance of things, the process of things, as much as a New York Times reporter might. I think Mickey Kaus, who used to be at the New Republic, now has his own website called kausfiles.com, and where he creates this blend of kind of reporting and attitude, and this is the kind of thing, unlike Matt Drudge, I think that you're going to see more of.
That's sort of what concerns me. I think to me, and maybe I'm too traditional or sort of old school, but it's just moving too fast. It's like we're talking at the Times of doing this new continuous news approach where we'll call in material from the road if news happens and put it on the website and so forth. And it's just like constant deadlines. And even we'll hire more people to help us with that. But it makes me a little nervous when you see people like the Wall Street Journal, the Dallas Morning News, people putting breaking stories out on their website before it appears in the paper. There's something that I like about just having a little time to breathe and knowing you have a story and having at least one normal news cycle, at least a day to mull it over and be sure you have it right before you just throw it out there.
But Rick, do you see a time when the actual physical paper is not the vehicle for breaking news, but the Time breaks its news on its website, and then your piece the next day is sort of a recap or more analytic or that sort of thing?
I think that may be what we're moving toward, and it's hard for me to picture that right now, but maybe I should just face reality. But there's something, to me, something sacred about a printed newspaper or magazine, and I just don't, maybe, I don't know, again, maybe I'm a traditionalist, but I just don't trust something that just comes out that's not on the printed page quite in the same way. It doesn't seem as thoughtful to me. And again, I'm probably, have to change my view in a year or two, but that's the way.
Well, there are a couple things going on here, it seems to me, and maybe we can focus on them a little. One seems to be that we're widening out the variety of opinion available to people. I guess connected to that is how many people. Are we, in fact, in a period that has seen declining voting for most of this century and that seems to be going on, reaching out to a wider number in a yet ever smaller audience? The second is this question of time, and not so much Time magazine, but the idea of deadlines and constantly breaking deadlines. And what Rick seems to be suggesting is that this kind of 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week deadline pressure is ramping up the need for breathless coverage, but may not be the best thing that we can do for readers, viewers, listeners in terms of analytics. Comments?
Sure, I would just qualify that word breathless and replace it with the word continuous and suggest that maybe the coverage you'll find won't be so thoughtful as Rick's, but would be more data-oriented, that you might see sort of essentially streaming news, like people can get streaming stock prices on their computer monitors. I think it's, you know, in the sort of world of convergence, this is all data, and it's all going to be, you know, all news, all stock prices, all entertainment, all the time. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think people might be able to put it in context, that it's not the same as a well-thought-out piece in the daily paper.
But if it's all data, how do people then distinguish between the phone book and news that Pearl Harbor's been attacked? What attaches significance to the
Isn't news that Pearl Harbor's been attacked data?
Well, that's my question. I mean, if it's translated into bytes on a constantly flowing news stream, how do we distinguish significance?
I think that maybe what we're talking about is a time when people are asked to sort of make up their own minds a lot more, and that they are given more raw information, and that, you know, institutions like the New York Times become less relevant.
Well, I think
God forbid.
I know. It would be very sad.
Like the New York Well, I think that what that means is that the importance of editors doesn't decline, it increases. That people are going to have to choose who they trust to play that role more, and they may have more choice, but you're still going to have to build up trust in particular institutions who's more accurate, who's more relevant, who's more timely.
Well, let's take this in terms of a story that broke last night, which is the Microsoft story. I mean, is the value, other than to those traders who were holding long positions in Microsoft, that they have the news instantaneously, that the judge has ruled on matters of fact in this case? Or does a larger audience really want a kind of information that reflects on the significance of this trial, not only for Microsoft, but technology and software in the American future?
You know, I think that's a good example of the type of way we're getting our news. At 6:30, that was flashed on all the screens, the TV screens, and secondly, it was up on websites, and people who really cared immediately went to either the Justice Department or other websites to get the 200-page decision. There was a burst of information or data, but no analysis or story of it right away. We decided to change our cover at the time, which we're working on today, because we feel that with all the burst of information coming out, there still needs to be some context and somebody say what's significant about it or not. Likewise, to take Rick's point, among the places I went to at about 7:30, 8 o'clock yesterday evening is the New York Times website to see what they were doing. And then late last night when I got here, I read Joel Brinkley's story, which, by the way, had been revised a few times because he was, you know, I mean, you all were up with the story, I think, faster than anybody could have read the 206-page thing. But with, you know, I mean, good, quick analysis of it that continually evolved through the evening. But one thing I needed, and at about 12:30 last night, I read all the stories, but you have on your website image of the front page, right, where you could actually see the front page of the New York Times. And that had not yet been posted. And until I knew whether it was a 4-column, 5-column, 1-column story, I was interested in figuring out how the New York Times would play it, how significant it would be. I mean, this is basically the image of the Times this morning. And this is how the Times tells you, basically. I mean, I'm sure they have an arcane system where they decide whether it's a, you know, 1-column to 5-column headline like that, or maybe even a banner across the page. So when you ask how do people sort out a new phone listing versus the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we have a lot of little touchstones. One of mine being how many columns does the New York Times put the headline on the front page?
But there'll be a web equivalent, Walter. I mean,
Right.
the headline is just a metaphor, and there'll be some translation into.
Right. In fact, I was going to say that is a valuable service that people will and have started doing on the web. When we create news hubs or MSNBC does or whatever, instead of just listing stories, I've always argued you have to find some signs of placement so that people can know what you think is important, because that's a value you're adding, which is to say, hey, the Microsoft case isn't all that important. We're putting it on the bottom of the page. And when we first created both Pathfinder, Roadrunner, and the Full Service Network, 2 out of 3 of which, as I said, failed miserably, one of the things we did was allow you to totally personalize it, which you can do on almost any web page like Yahoo News or whatever. You can say, I'm interested in this, 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 and this, and I'm not interested in that, and here's my sports teams, and here's my stocks I own. So when you came into Roadrunner, which is our cable online service, your front page was totally different than maybe even your wife's front page or your neighbor's front page. And I kind of resisted that, thinking that one value we could add is being the common ground, to say everybody, in your neighborhood, in the world, or whatever, is going to be talking about these things. And even if you're not interested in business and technology, that Microsoft story should be at the top of your page.
Right.
I also think maybe we should think about what this means for political coverage too, because with this great void of, with all these new outlets and so forth, everyone's rushing to fill the void, and I think there's maybe a focus more on the dramatic and maybe not as much the substance sometimes in coverage. I remember I was here when that, was it the State of the Union happening the same time as the OJ verdict, and we saw it on the split screen, and I remember that was like, we were all watching in that room over there. It was like a turning point, I think, maybe in journalism and coverage. And here we were, the State of the Union, and the press focusing as much on this dramatic murder case. And I think it's already changed how we cover politics and how campaigns are unfolding. When a campaign can find out what you're writing before you've written it and is reacting, I mean, it speeds everything up, and there's a tendency maybe to focus on the drama rather, as I said, rather than the substance.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember watching that split screen image too, and that was what we called the magazine a very George moment, when you have people trying to decide which of two things is not more important really, but which is more entertaining. I happen to think the OJ verdict was more important anyway, and it was certainly more entertaining than another long-winded Bill Clinton State of the Union speech. But I also thought of this recently when I was reading your own newspaper and saw that Payne Stewart's tragic death was a page 1 story, and the death of John Chafee on the same day was buried on A30 or something. Now, they're both accomplished men, but I would think that a senator of decades of public service might merit more coverage than a golfer who died in I guess he hadn't even won that many tournaments lately. But
well, maybe this is moving us into. Let me hold on, Rick. Just I think this is moving us into an interesting and important area and away from technology per se, but it interlinks with a couple of themes that have already come up, which is one, the place of marketing in relationship to the news. And 2, what it is that we're going to cover in the next century when we talk about politics. And I think we've already got on the table a couple of what I suspect are slightly different views about the significance of that split screen. Others,
Well,
Ramesh.
If we talk about politics, I mean, I think more important than technological shifts, or, I mean, a bigger problem for political journalism than technological shifts or commercial considerations is a declining public interest in politics. And it's not just expressed in the voting figures, but audiences for political talk shows, circulation for political magazines. How many people buy these? How many people buy these buy political books? Our circulation's doing fine, but a lot of other publications haven't been in the last 3-4 years.
Is this a good or a bad thing that people's interest in politics has declined?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's a mixed thing. I think I would tend to think it's on balance negative, but then, of course, it threatens my livelihood.
Well, let's start with the assumption that the public expenditure is 1/3 of gross domestic product, and that government law and regulation exercises enormous control over other large parts of it, perhaps 50% or more of the economy. So presumably politics remains germane in some form or another to people's lives.
But see, it's not, I would argue with that thesis that the public interest in politics is declining. I think that it's in fact the way that politics is presented to the public that is the problem, not the public's interest. Now, of course, I have something of a bias here because George is
unique in politics.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
suppose, yeah.
Well, I'm admitting it, so that's
all right. That's unique, great.
But George obviously has a very different kind of take on how politics should be written about, how it should be covered, which is to say that in our culture, political news is competing with essentially an entertainment culture where people can much more easily and enjoyably gravitate towards news about movies, about the stock market, about business, than about politics, and that political journalism hasn't realized that it's not sort of competing with other kind of decades of political journalism. It's competing with cable television. It's competing with E! It's competing with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so, you know, the mode of presentation is the problem, not the public's interest.
But the danger there, of course, is that you end up covering politics as culture, politics as psychology, politics as entertainment, politics as everything except for politics.
Isn't it the case that in the last presidential cycle, something like 70 million households turned on the presidential debates, and I don't think there's a TV entertainment show that draws more than 15, 16, 17. There might be ER, might draw 20 million households. Is it fair to say that we've shifted entirely into an entertainment culture, or has the press itself shifted into an entertainment culture that in some sense is leading?
Well, I don't know the numbers, but first I think that if you talk to anyone in Washington and say, hey, which has more success in drawing viewers, you know, C-SPAN or the movie of the week, they're not going to say C-SPAN. And also, you know, the reason that people watch these debates, aside from the fact that they affect their lives, is because they're entertaining. They want to see people kind of go at it with each other. They want to see a gaffe. This is, you know, Rick, you spoke last night about how you thought it would be, I think you said, more interesting or a good thing if there were more candidates on the Democratic side. And I think the reason for that is not necessarily because these guys, Gore and Bradley, aren't qualified or experienced or don't have well thought out positions. It's because they're dull. I mean, we all would like...
I want to be entertained.
I'm saying there is yeah, basically. And I think most of us want to be entertained by it.
That's probably right.
And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't mean that as an insult.
I think you're right in the sense that we have an obligation to make when we write about politics, make it as accessible and as we can, and to draw the reader in. I think that's part of our obligation. It doesn't mean we're dumbing down the coverage, but we have to realize that there's so many outlets out there competing for people's attention that we have no choice, and that's why you're seeing color in the New York Times, and that's why you're seeing redesigns of all the magazines and so forth, and maybe brighter writing just to get people's attention.
Mm-hmm. I think that's as it should be, though. Yeah, I mean, this great marketplace of information and entertainment, I think politics should have to be out there competing along with anything else. I think political writers and politicians should sort of say, we have to make the case about why you should pay attention to us, rather than we are so important, we're going to take it for granted.
Let me just, for the sake of argument, first of all say that I think people are less interested in politics. I'm surprised if it's 70 million watching the debates. Maybe the stat's right, but it seems a little high. But clearly people are participating a little bit less in voting. I think they're watching it a little bit less. And I'm not sure this is absolutely a bad thing, even though it may control a lot of our budget, because the great ideological divides and the huge issues from Vietnam to the civil rights movement that energized me when I became a political junkie are not present at the moment. There's important issues like HMO reform, and if you can figure out whose budget numbers are right, Bradley's or Gore's, you really are a model citizen. But, it's not quite the same as growing up in Louisiana in the 60s, when you had to either be involved or against, and it really mattered to life. Now, I actually think that's not the worst thing to happen to society, that most of the grand ideological struggles are not going to be affected hugely, even by whether we choose George Bush or Bill Bradley. They're both, life will go on pretty much the way it would have for most of us. I actually think that probably the most important thing to happen in Washington this year was not even the bombing of Serbia, but was the decision last night on Microsoft, because it will affect how enterprise and competitiveness work in the digital revolution. So, and that's not something that's a pure political thing. I mean, you can say, well, you have to elect the right president, but I mean, nobody in this room could tell me who appointed Judge Jackson, so it's, it's an indirect political thing.
Robert?
Well, I think a country consumed by politics is not a happy country, but a country that cultivates a pseudo-sophisticated cynicism toward politics, I think will find itself getting into trouble. For one thing, it won't be able to actually hold serious malefactors accountable, because everybody will say, well, everybody does that. And I may feel that more strongly than other people, because this is something which I think both the media and conservatives in particular have done a lot to contribute to, and now are both suffering from.
Let me pick up on that. Gary Wills was here the night before last, and I was on a panel with him yesterday. And Nathan Glazer rose to ask Gary a question, and the question was, are we not at the end of an era that we may or may not have recognized in terms of this pervasive anti-government cynicism? And he pointed to Bill Kristol and several others in the conservative community. He pointed actually to George Bush's speech in New York, saying, we conservatives have been too hard on government, a striking contrast from Bill Clinton and the limited government and the end of big government 5 or 6 years ago. I guess the question is, are we in a larger political, cultural sense coming to the end of an era and beginning another, though we may not know the frame of it, that may actually make politics at least less, I don't want to say fearful, but less despised, less distanced from Americans? We've already seen Pew polls that show that confidence in government has been going up for the last couple of years in contrast to a 30-year decline.
Well, wait, there's two separate issues there. One, despising government or being cynical about it is one basket of issues. And the other is having other interests that seem more important to your lives than government. I think you're right. The cynicism, and for that matter, the hatred of government that infected us throughout the 80s was both bad and it's ending. Feeling that especially Washington is not the most important thing that happens to us these days is both real and I think valid.
I think that's absolutely the case. I think people just don't have time to be angry or inclination to be angry at their politicians or at Washington anymore. They're reasonably content these days, so why even bother? I mean, they're just more detached, maybe still a little alienated, but the energy, the focus, the anger is not what it was even a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think this may be the president's real legacy, is he's basically made government work pretty well for most people. And that sort of era of that kind of attitude that I think gave way to Ross Perot actually being a viable candidate, although not that viable in the end, it has really changed, which is why the Reform Party now sort of seems like a bunch of crazies, sort of over here. Which is great fun to watch, but not particularly relevant. And I guess I find, yes, there's cynicism, but I also find much more optimism and sincerity about government than maybe some of the other panelists. I don't know, maybe it's because I work for a magazine that is kind of explicitly and expressly optimistic about public service, and we attract people who share that view. But at least from our readers, there doesn't seem to be that kind of knee-jerk cynicism or hatred of politicians in Washington.
Where does that optimism, explicit optimism as you describe it, take you in terms of young people sitting here today? I mean, what's the message then going into the new millennium? What are we to be optimistic about explicitly?
Well, I guess the message from our point of view would be that you don't, you don't all have to go into kind of tech jobs,
Or investment banking.
Or investment banking, yeah, and that this, this realm of our public life, government, public service, which has been de-emphasized in this decade because people have been making so much money, and because, as Walter's talked about, the digital revolution has really been kind of the story of the decade. But that will not be true forever. Things will not always be going so well economically or socially. And then government will, I think, reemerge in an even bigger way as a force. The Microsoft case might be a foreshadowing of this. And then if you approach it with that kind of cynicism, that's a very big problem. But if you approach it with a kind of more realistic and perhaps even optimistic attitude, things might work out.
I think part of what's going on is that for much of this century, politics and journalism have depended to a significant degree on a crisis mentality. You've got an energy crisis here, a drug crisis there, a healthcare crisis, and of course the Cold War makes that sort of mentality much more reasonable. And I think that's over now. I mean, and I think that that's something that both politics and journalism have not quite adapted to, that you can talk about a moral crisis or whatever, but it's just not going to work.
Actually, I think Clinton adapted to it real well, which is why it's so successful.
After 94.
Yeah.
I still would argue, even though people may be more optimistic, I think my general sense is politics, considering what we've been through with Clinton and the scandals and so forth, is not what it used to be. It's not the sunny, happy thing. Public service isn't as enticing as it used to be. I've talked to a lot of people who were thinking of running for office, for Congress and so forth, and decided not to because it's just not worth it anymore. What they see is the intrusion into their lives, the demands, the extreme partisanship and sort of ugliness in Congress and on the Hill and so forth. So even though maybe attitudes I think are a little better in the public, I think people and probably young people have sort of a different view of public service than they might have, before, this Clinton business and other things have happened that I think have soured a lot of people.
But maybe then what you're headed toward is sort of what we're beginning to see now with people who are not really politicians, like Donald Trump and Jesse Ventura, sort of venturing into that arena, people who are used to the intrusions that come with being a public figure in a different context, and have established themselves, and made their money, perhaps already, a sort of new breed of politician, rather than the person who works his or her way up through, local and state and then national political structures.
Let me just ask one more question to follow up on this, and then open it up to the audience. Are the things that we're saying about government more applicable to the federal government than to state and local governments? Is there reason to be, in your terms, more explicitly optimistic about what's going on at state and local levels? And secondly, are we framing this too narrowly when we talk about politics as government? Are there non-governmental organizations, to use the term that's popular nowadays, rising around the country that are entry points for young people into American political life, but that aren't necessarily about specifically electoral competition or legislative or executive service? Are you? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure, there are all sorts of organizations springing up, and certainly I find that young people in particular are more interested in doing that and making a difference that way than in traditionally conceived politics. But traditional politics is still there. I mean, as you said, a third of the economy is being allocated that way, and I just don't think there's a substitute for that.
Let me invite some questions, unless there's some other comments. Rick?
No, I was just going to comment on your state and local government question.
Please.
I don't think it's that different on the state and local level. I think there's some of the same problems we're seeing nationally on the federal level with the financial demands it takes to run for office and the competitiveness and the partisanship. I think we're seeing that all played out locally too. So I don't know if there's that much difference.
Yeah, any other?
Well, I think people are not as interested in going into public office and running in politics.
This is electoral.
Electoral office, to make your distinction. And I think that's quite understandable. I don't think that's where you make the most impact on the world these days, despite statistics about a third of the economy, et cetera. I think there are lots of ways on a community level people truly can make an impact, and that's happening a lot. That's where the end of the cynicism of the 80s really kicked in, when people started getting involved. And I would even defend people who go into the field of technology and the digital revolution, which I think has more of an impact on more people's lives than politics does these days. And I mean that globally, too. Not just in terms of the information you can get, the access you have to things. Last month I was in China for a few weeks. And I went to a tiny village called Kashgar, which is really in the middle of nowhere. It's on the other side of the Gobi Desert from the rest of China. It's near the Turkmenistan border. And in a cafe on an unpaved street, I wandered in and with a translator and a couple people, and there's 3 computers in the back, and there's some kids playing on them, and they were connected to the internet. I was somewhat surprised, and I asked them, can I use it? And I typed in time.com, and of course, since we had run something from the Dalai Lama and Wei Zhejiang that week, it was blocked by the government. I typed in CNN, and it was blocked by the government. And then one of the kids who speaks Uyghur, I mean, they don't speak Chinese, elbowed me aside, and boom, time pops up, and then CNN. I said, what'd you do? And so he says, oh, we go through proxy servers in Hong Kong, we can get around the government censorship.
Right.
I think that will change China more than all the debates about WTO and Chinese favorite, not most favorite, whatever it's called now, normal trading relations status.
Let's start over on this side. Please identify yourself, and then we'll move back and forth.
I don't know how much identification you want. My name is Mariah Starr, graduate in '99, former staff writer of the Harvard Political Review. I guess I'll go with your statement about local government and especially about China as my launching pad. I wanted to know if, especially with new media, if you think that the entire structure of the economics, speech, et cetera, is being changed, because what I notice is that most of your analysis is in the realm of, sort of market analysis. The best ideas will come forth as you get a lot of competition. And while I agree that there is some sense of that there will be better ideas produced, what I also notice that as I survey, most of the websites out there, they either have the same information, which means they don't really produce much, or they, or if they do have different information, they have very little analysis. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think one of the problems with the new media is that, well, yes, it doesn't have a way to really highlight, the most important information. We still turn to the New York Times, to Time Magazine, and other sources for information. And I'm just wondering if you think that, how do you think the structure, like what we focus on in terms of what information is, what power is. I mean, even in Iran, the internet is changing the very way that the people in democracy associate with their government. And I'm wondering if you think the, whether or not the fundamental units of analysis you're using are a bit outdated, it seems. Or if you think that the way you're thinking of government and the entire policy, the entire way the world works is, as you said, about the change as global democracy comes about, international economics comes about. It seems like we're on the verge of a whole brand new era of just how to deal with these issues overall.
That was so long as to constitute almost a seminar. Have you got a 2-sentence version of that?
No.
I'm wondering if you can sort of see a big picture of, do you think that the internet will change not only how you do business, but how you think about this?
Okay. Who wants to take that one?
I guess, I hope so, because I think that the one thing that you said that sort of really registered with me is this idea that the relationship between analyzing information and just providing it. And I can't see, you can argue this round or you can argue it flat. You can argue that things like the Times and Time become even more important as people are inundated with information. Or you can argue it, which is the way I lean towards saying that people will become more, and I hate this word, but empowered, and become their own analysts. And I think if things kind of move in that direction, then you move in the direction of far greater participatory democracy, and that is a kind of revolutionary force around the world. It's an old paradigm with more and more probability.
All right. Anybody else on this question? Or we'll go
address your question.
It does, yes.
All right, over here.
Hi, my name is Maddie Germer. I'm a freshman here at the college, and I'm also on the staff of the HPR. In our 30th anniversary issue, we addressed the ideas of activism versus apathy, and the argument that our editor makes in his letter is that we're not apathetic, but we're simply overwhelmed because there's so many causes for our generation to want to work for, to be interested in, to try to change. And I think that one of the things causing that is the media overload that our generation faces. And speaking from a journalist perspective, what do you think journalists can do to focus the energy of our generation towards these issues instead of simply throwing them at us and making us to where we don't know how to choose?
Well, as sympathetic as I am to the problem, it's going to exist because you're going to have 10,000 possible sources of information rather than focused information the way my generation did. You know, when I was here, Walter Cronkite told us the way it was each night, and when and we knew what was important. Secondly, there are no huge overriding issues in my mind the way there were in the 60s and 70s. And there may have been 6 or 7 overriding issues, but there were civil rights, Vietnam, nuclear, arms control, that sort of thing. Now, everything from education to the environment on up, there will be important issues, and you will have people who are passionate about them providing information, and you have both the luxury and the problem of choosing more information sources and getting more data overload. And I think that's sort of a cool thing. I wish I were living in that period when I was in college.
And let me say, we're all in this together. We have the same problem. I mean, I could spend half the day or most of the day reading all the political stories that I think I need to know about, and I just don't. I just sort of shove it aside, and you just have to pick and choose and hope for the best, because there is this information overload, which may not be a bad thing.
Let me step out of the moderator's role for just a second and say a couple of things in slight contrast to Walter's, since we're both of the same generation. 2 things. One is, after a certain point, the number of sources of information become irrelevant because the marginal ability to utilize them approaches 0. I don't think that any of us really thinks that because there are 10,000 sites rather than 1,200 newspapers, that the situation has gotten desperately worse, because none of us was reading 1,200 daily newspapers in the United States back in the 1960s. So I think that while we focus a lot on the enormous number of news sources available to us today, we have to remember the limits of human consciousness and the capacity for us to monitor those various sources and accept the fact that we're not ever going to be able to tap into all those sources, and weren't even 30 years ago. Over here.
Hi, my name is Megan Seibel. I'm a freshman at the college, and you had spoken about the changing general interest in politics, and I'm curious to know how you keep up with the general interest for news, and do you just reference poll data that's already published? Do you monitor how many people will click on certain news stories at your website, or do you commission your own polls? How do you monitor the changing market for news?
For me, it's much more old-fashioned as a magazine editor in terms of trying to figure out what people are interested in and what they'd like to read about and what actually works within the magazine. I mean, it's really a function of talking to people and reading the letters and the emails that they write. I mean, there's so much kind of electronic data available that it does become a little bit like sort of white noise. And the actual, 2 people sort of remarking on an article to me can mean more than, a poll. For one thing, it's much more interesting, and that really helps. If they have an actual thought about it rather than just sort of a data bite, a percentage or a statistic, then it's much more useful and instructive for me.
One problem is not just getting information about what readers want, because there's more ways to do that now, especially with the web. It's going into this internet world and balancing what you know could pander to the most possible readers and get the most possible readers versus what you went into journalism to do in the first place. And I can affect the sales of any weekly issue of Time magazine by 50%, the newsstand sales. I mean, I can, if I put low-carb diets as I did on the cover last week, I know it will sell 50% more than the week before, you know, we're doing a science or foreign policy cover. And so you have to have that mix, and that's one of the challenges I think we face in journalism now. As we get so much feedback, we have to learn how not to pander to the short-term interests of our readers in order for the long-term common good, why we went into journalism, and I think the long-term interests of our readers.
Rick?
No, I was just going to say there are a lot of struggles that we're all facing. My job as a political reporter, I'm not as worried about our overall circulation or who our readers are. My job is sort of more as an advocate for political news because that's what I do. So I push it and tell my editors, there's this great appetite. We need to write about what's going on. We need more coverage, more reporters, more attention, more front page stories. This is starting earlier this year. Let's get going. And they're telling me, it's too soon, no one cares. And it's all anecdotal. It's just all sort of from our own perspectives. So it's a struggle, even at my own newspaper, where the bosses in New York are thinking, does anyone really care what's happening in Iowa and New Hampshire this early? And I say, yes, yes, yes. And we kind of end up doing it not as quickly as I want to do it, but probably faster than they think is necessary.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Darpa Betancourt. I'm a senior here, and my question is back to the idea of sort of virtual data. How do you perceive your roles as recorders of history and almost shapers of culture? Because as anyone who's had their sort of hard drive crash and lost everything on it, virtual data just isn't real in the same way that printed material is, especially across time. So with this move towards maybe rendering printed material obsolete with the proliferation of the web, how do you perceive sort of that idea of sort of across time having a record of our times and of our culture?
I think you're right about print, and Rick has said it as well, the tangibility of it. When I came back from having spent a few years in cyberspace, it occurred to me that if over the last 500 years, we had been getting all of our information electronically onto screens as data and bits, and some modern day, Harry Gutenberg had come along and invented a way to translate that information and put it onto paper with pictures and lay it out and put it into magazines and stuff like that, that you could roll up, put in your back pocket, take on the bus, take into the bathroom, take into the backyard, that you could keep and that you could flip through interactively and have a nice tactile experience with. People would say, wow, what an amazing new technology. That's going to replace the internet. So I do think that there has been a good 500-year run for print, and there's probably another 500 years left for it.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Yellen. I'm a senior here at the college. And addressing the conflation of entertainment and politics, as well as the declining interest in politics that you were talking about, do you see a way of making politics more accessible without submitting to the celebritization of politics? And as Mr. Isaacson had mentioned, that this declining interest, it's not, we shouldn't be too worried about it. Is it necessary to think of, to try to create a new venue, a new approach to making politics more accessible?
It's a good question. As you can imagine, George, we think about it a lot because we've been accused of that once or twice. But, and I guess what I would say is I'd make a distinction between the word celebritization and humanization. I mean, we write about people. Many of them tend to be celebrities, but I also think that the culture in general is pushing more and more towards people who are not traditional celebrities, acquiring some of the skills and talents that traditional celebrities have. Media, friendliness, being able to be good on television, attractiveness, physically and socially. These are things that I think are, like it or not, going to be sort of skills in a new world, And I think that's going to apply to the political world as well. So I don't think that we're contributing to it. I think we're reflecting it and sort of embracing it in the sense that we know this is happening, we're pointing it out, and we're sort of saying, okay, then given that this is happening, let's write about these people with the understanding that it's happening. Let's write about them as celebrities because, in fact, they either are or they are in the process of becoming that. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Chris Casatelli. I've been a journalist for 15 years, 3 years as an online journalist. Do you consider Matt Drudge to be a journalist? And if so, how do you reconcile the fact that he doesn't even attempt to follow any sort of code of standards that the rest of the profession does?
That's the thing from Walter Winchell 50 years ago. What do we?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I'm a very conflicted defender of Matt Drudge because I do think he's a journalist because I think I define journalists very broadly, and I think that it should be defined very broadly. And obviously, if I include Matt in that category, then I do. I mean, I think he's a very bad journalist, and and I've told him that. I mean, but sure, yeah. I mean, he reports things. He tries to find news. He tries to make news. He's wrong a lot.
The good thing about the digital age is that journalism can no longer be an elite, can no longer be a clique or a club with self-defined, you get entry or you don't get entry rules. There was a good thing about the clique, the club, only qualified people allowed to enter, and every now and then a new rule would be handed down from the altar of Woodward and Bernstein. That would be like two-source rule or something, and then we'd all adopt the rule or pretend to adopt the rule. But that elitism and that clubbiness and that cliquishness and that, we have a badge and we're journalists and you're not, probably was not the greatest thing. And I applaud Matt Drudge for breaking that sense of elitism that pervaded journalism.
Over here.
Rick. I have to say, though, I have serious concerns about people that don't check things out and double confirm things and check with sources and just put information out for public consumption that other publications couldn't confirm, and I think it's dangerous.
But it seems to me like as an online journalist, he's of particular concern to you because online journalists are struggling to become credible and to gain the kind of, cultural respectability that print journalists may have had once upon a time. And Matt makes that harder for you.
90% of what Matt Drudge does, as Rick has found out this weekend or this week, is report what print people are about to report and give, and from the Monica Lewinsky break to your John McCain story, he has very rarely taken notebook in hand and gone out and reported something with his own eyes and legs.
He's free-written. Over here.
I'm Adam Lauritsen. I'm the features editor of the Harvard Political Review. There was a discussion earlier about a common ground in the media where we have the same stories reaching all individuals. Do you believe that we're losing this common ground now that we're trying to narrowcast or look specifically at different markets? And if we are losing this common ground, how is that going to affect our ability to be informed citizens in a functioning democracy?
I worry a bit about the common ground issue, and I was saying that when we started tailoring our new internet sites and electronic sources, and so everybody got different news depending on their interests. I think there is a yearning, however. I mean, I tend to believe that people are smart and good, and I believe in democracy. I think the more choices people have of information stuff, the better they'll be, not the worse, because... So I think there is a yearning for a common ground, and I would consider that's one of the roles that Time Magazine plays, New York Times plays, and others, which is why we will continue to have a role, albeit not the same role we used to have in this pantheon of sources of information, because people will say, I'm curious about a lot of things, including what everybody else may be talking about. I have very little interest, say, in Harry Potter, But when we put it on the cover, it's because that week everybody's talking about it, and even people who were, say, you know, businessmen in the high-tech industry probably felt they should have some clue of who this kid was, or this fictional kid was, because it was the thing people were talking about. That can be common ground as well. It's not just we all have to know whether or not we had a good bombing run on Kosovo, you know, today. It's what is everybody talking about? The water cooler stuff, the ability to go to work, go have a beer after work, and when people start talking about something, not to be totally clueless. If you ask people why they get Time magazine, one reason is they say, I don't want to be clueless about things people are talking about. That's another way of saying common ground.
I think also, just a couple points. I agree with what Walter's saying, but people might also be finding their common ground more and more through pop cultural events, like the Simpson verdict, like the last Seinfeld episode, that kind of thing. And so we might be moving in an age where kind of pop culture is the unifying element in the country. But I'd also say that I don't think this is a new phenomenon, a new trend, this kind of, you know, dividing up of the country into niche markets. And Rick was talking last night about A.M. Rosenthal and how, I guess 15 or 20 years ago, he had created special sections for the New York Times, Science Times, Home, et cetera. And I could imagine in 5 or 10 years, a New York Times where the front page is actually the flexible section, and sort of as with Walter was doing with his site, the New York Times you receive is tailored to the news that you want. And I do think that'll be interesting. I don't know what happens with that.
See, I think that's dangerous. I mean, not just dangerous. I think one reason I want the New York Times is I want to know what every other person I'll probably run into that day thinks is important. And once we get, the value of the New York Times would go down for me if it started personalizing it for my interests. On the other hand, Yahoo's value to me is it's totally personalized to my interests. When I pop up my Yahoo, it tells me everything, you know, it even, you know, searches, you know, Time Warner information or whatever it may be. So there will be a yearning for some institutions to provide you the common ground. And I would say, with all, not trying to flatter Rick, probably the most important one to me in terms of common ground is what does the front page of the New York Times look like today?
I don't think that, that pop culture is a unifying element. I mean, Seinfeld, if you take the share of the viewing audience and put it 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been the #1 show. It wouldn't have even been in the top 10. Pop culture is diversifying. And I don't think that's a terrible thing. I mean, the criticism social critics used to make about the media 2-3 decades ago was it was encouraging an unhealthy homogeneity in the culture. And I think it's wrong to think of the situation of the mid-century as the American norm. It isn't. We're returning to a more decentralized democratic model that's, I think, been more the historical norm in the US. And what we need is a common sense, I think, of citizenship. Not activism, not apathy, but citizenship. And that's something that a techie and an investment banker they can both be good citizens.
Common motif as well, and maybe Walter can comment on this, but last year when I was doing some research on the Lewinsky story, I was talking to the circulation director of Newsweek. And he was saying, interestingly enough, that in the last several years, some of their very best-selling covers have been about religion in American life, certainly not definable as an element of pop culture, although it certainly has dimensions of it. Is that true for Time as well?
Oh yeah, religion always sells well. One of the interesting things, every now and then news magazines get accused of going soft. Going real soft doesn't help. I mean, I put only one movie star on the cover this year, and it was a sort of a semi-naked Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. That sold, you know, average, but not very well. A Columbine is a huge seller, but also, you know, things like religion and science are huge sellers because it appeals to, gee, I don't want to be clueless about something other people know about. And, you know, we can all, as I say, if I want to, and health is, it shifts. I mean, things that affect your lives personally, especially your life at home, has become so much more important to consumers of news that anything from a Columbine to should I have laser eye surgery are the things that shoot off the charts when it comes to selling for a news magazine, at least. And by the way, for the nightly news and the ratings.
It looks to me as if we're coming up on the end of the time allotted for this panel. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions. I'd like to thank our panelists this morning. for rising and being at a 10 a.m. Saturday morning panel. You're all to be congratulated for that. I had a head start. I've got a 2-year-old, so I've been up since 5:30. And I can tell you a lot about Harry Potter if you want to afterwards for my 7-year-old. Thank you all very much for coming, and I hope our panelists will remain for a few minutes afterwards for those of you who didn't have a chance to ask questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Parker. Here's where we are on our conference schedule. We now have about a 15-minute break between the end of this panel and our first breakout session, which begins at 11:30. At 11:30, Hannah Choi and Dimple Chowdhury will be standing right here, and they will lead everyone in your folder when you registered. There's a label on it that says which session you've chosen. Mark Halprin will be leading one session in Taubman 275 on Jennifer Flowers in the 1992 presidential election.